So hello and welcome to my presentation on the paper entitled Scaffolding Stakeholder-centric Enterprise Model Articulation. My name is Stefan Oppel. I've co-authored this paper with Stein Hoppenbrauers. I'm originally from the University of Linz in Austria, but I'm currently spending a few months as a guest researcher in Nijmegen and work on the topic that I'm going to present now for a few months now. Well, let me briefly introduce you to what we mean with articulation in enterprise model articulation. Our starting point is that we have people working in organizational reality, collaborating, doing collaborative work, and what we have to recognize, what we have to account for is that those people have different views on reality, only perceive a certain portion of reality, only perceive their working area, maybe perceive what others expect from them, what interpret what they can provide others with. The problem is at those points where they need to collaborate, they have to rely on their closure of what others expect from them. And our aim, or my aim in the last few years, actually, been doing research on how to support people to become aware of their individual assumptions of their work and the individual assumptions of how others work, and support them in aligning their views. Briefly give an account on the method that I've developed there. The point was, at some point in time, we figured that so this is done by means of conceptual modeling, obviously, because that's the reason why the paper is entitled Articulating Enterprise Models. One thing we need to make sure is that people are actually able to do this kind of modeling, to use models for their articulation and alignment activities. And what we very quickly found is that this cannot be assumed. These skills, the ability to perform modeling in a way that leads to those ends, cannot be assumed to be present. So I started thinking about how to support this and came up with the educational concept of scaffolding. Scaffolding has been developed over like the last 20 or 30 years in the context of educational research, and refers to, like in architecture, building a scaffold, building supporting structures that allow oneself, like in the physical world, to build physical structures and then gradually remove those scaffolds as soon as those structures can support themselves. And in education, this is transferred to knowledge, building up knowledge until it can support itself, until people know how to progress from the point they are currently. This research in educational sciences has come up with several principles, several forms of scaffolding, and several principles of scaffolding. Let me give you a brief overview. The first one that is proposed is conceptual scaffolding. So providing a scaffold in terms of providing motivation why a topic might be of importance. Like in this picture, you might want to think about the outside temperatures, because if the water is frozen outside, kayaking will become a bit harder than it used to be, actually. Metacognitive scaffolds would then be a bit more invasive and point at what potentially could be important to think about before people actually start to act. Strategic scaffolds then already indicate potential solution paths for a given problem. So point out strategies that could be used to solve a particular problem. And finally, we get procedural scaffolds, the most invasive form, the most strict guidance, already guiding the solution process itself. So providing people with the steps they need to perform to find their solutions. So this is the usually accepted different forms of scaffolding in literature, but scaffolding itself is not complete if we do not adhere to the principles of scaffolding. You might remember I told you before we have this metaphor of scaffolds adapted from the physical world, and at some point in time scaffolds are simply removed because the building has been completed. This is also present in educational scaffolding. So the first principle is called contingency. So we want to provide adaptive support to observe what people currently struggle with and provide support according to the perceptions of what is currently complicated. Then we get fading. Fading refers to removing the scaffold, basically. So reducing support measures with continuing learning progress. So maybe not indicating that people need to go around the wall, but only indicating that this is a wall and you might want to consider what you want to do. And finally, closely linked to fading, we get transfer of responsibility, referring to the fact that we put learners in charge with rising skill level, not only in terms of learning, but also in terms of trying to get support, perceive when they need support, and then actively trying to get this support. Well, bringing this articulation through modeling and scaffolding together, we finally came up with this kind of framework. So the result of the paper basically is a framework that should guide ultimately the design of scaffolding for enterprise model articulation. Just let me briefly go through the components in this framework. We first get this modeling setup where we get different individuals who actually work together in the real world and who should be able to articulate their views on their work and then their interfaces with others in form of a model. The model at some point needs to be represented in a certain form so that we can do something with it, either use it for documentation purposes or even use it for execution purposes. And articulation itself is not enough. We also get into this alignment stage where people try to align their views, their mental models about their work, so in order to avoid conflicts when working together. This can be done by different forms of scaffolding. So you remember those 4 types of scaffolds we described first before. And we get conceptual scaffolds. They're motivating why the topic of articulation or the topic we articulate about, both is important. We get those metacognitive scaffolds, a bit more invasive. See this at the very top, where we point at the concepts of the notation in terms of representation. We point at what to think about when doing articulation. So thinking about, for example, one's own work activities, thinking whom you are collaborating with, thinking about what you exchange with people in terms of information or materials. And finally, we got this model alignments, metacognitive skills, which should point at which aspects should actually be subject of alignment. So should it be important to question one's own work activities, or is it sufficient, for example, to solely talk about and align the interfaces? On a strategic level, we get even more strict guidance. So we get already directions of how to create a correct model, how to structure articulation in terms of preparing one's own results for model alignment. And finally, we get the procedures, not really the procedures, but the guidelines, the principles of how to reach a shared understanding. And on the rightmost level, we get the procedural scaffolds, where we actually have scripts and rules that really procedurally guide those activities. And we finally get this facilitator role, who observes what the group actually needs. And facilitator here is drawn as a human being, but actually in literature is discussed, heavily discussed, whether this can at least in part be automated. But for the moment right now we stick with a human facilitator. And this diagnosis then leads to identification of contingency, the potential of fading, and transfer of responsibility. And this in turn allows us to select, or allows a facilitator to select appropriate scaffolds, depending on the needs of the group, depending on the necessary invasiveness of intervention. I already mentioned this before. So just a brief overview about the methods that we developed. A three-stage process based on multi-perspective articulation. So we first start with a concept map-based setting the stage activities just to develop a common vocabulary. Then start with individual articulation. You can recognize maybe the color codes. Blue ones being the actors, the red ones being the activities that need to be performed, and the yellow ones being the information or the materials that are exchanged. Everybody does this for their own, and then in the third step, during collaborative alignment, if the models are structured in the form that is proposed here, it's pretty easy and pretty straightforward to bring together all these part models and identify where the potential mismatches, and then finally at least know what we need to talk about in order to come to a common understanding, and also then doing this and agreeing on a common way of implementing a work process. So this is what we came up with at some point in time in terms of scaffolding for the different types of scaffolds and the different modeling phases. What you can recognize at the very bottom is that we also get different sources of scaffolding, namely the facilitator, static media like text or graphics, and the other modelers who can also, so peer-based scaffolding, who can also act as providers of scaffolds. Let me just give you one example about those model layouting templates you just recognized on the last slide, how the models need to be structured, and we support this. We guide people without providing them with rules, just to provide them with a template that indicates how the models should be structured. Well, what we did after designing all these scaffolds according to this framework was to examine whether this actually worked and whether our framework is able to explain our observations on what actually worked during support of modeling and what didn't. In the paper we have 3 cases. We review 3 cases, the first one being that one. What you can recognize is that it pretty strictly and pretty well resembles the modeling structure guidelines. So basically perfect result, everything we could expect in terms of further processing, because if a model is layouted that way, we can automatically transform it to an executable process model and do directly simulation, and then do role-playing, guided role-playing games with people in order to refine those processes. Still, if we review this in terms of our framework, what we could observe is that the facilitator only deployed the strategic and procedural scaffolds on model representation level and did not use any of the others. Furthermore, he did no fading or transfer of responsibility at all. So he basically forced the participants to strictly adhere to the processes and intervened very strictly if they tried to do something else. This resulted basically in a perfect representation, as we have seen. This resulted in some kind of model articulation, at least at the very beginning of the workshop. People tried to express their own views. You can recognize that they described their work basically. What actually didn't happen at all is some kind of model alignment. So the facilitator then took over and explained to people what they actually do. So no transfer of responsibility, no fading. The original purpose of the workshop in terms of articulation and alignment basically failed. Second example, contrasting one that's like that one, the first one, that was from a workshop in industrial production. Second one being from a workshop with social workers reporting on how they organize a street dance event. And that's not the figures of how to step during dancing, but that's actually their representation of what they do and who is involved. Turns out, if we again review the workshop in terms of how it was implemented, that the facilitator only deployed metacognitive scaffolds and at the very beginning transferred full responsibility to the people in organizing their modeling process. So they would have been responsible for demanding more strict guidance, but as they were completely overwhelmed with the task, they didn't even get the idea of demanding more strict guidance. So basically, as you have recognized, model representation did not work, not only in the layout terms but also in semantic terms. So they redefined the modeling elements. Also, they were originally communicated. Model articulation worked pretty well at the very beginning, but rather quickly declined. And model alignment again didn't happen at all, so people simply contributed their own individual views, and then somehow, if I remember right, just two people drew the connections afterwards. So no development of a common understanding, actually. Well, and finally, the third case being an intermediate one, having a facilitator that has deployed some kind of laissez-faire style, and a facilitator that, as we will see in just a minute, has actively deployed scaffolding principles. So they started out with strategic scaffolds, providing people with those layout guidelines, for example, for model representation, explaining to them how they should proceed when doing the initial articulation, and how they could identify where they have mismatching perceptions of how to collaborate. And then, as I just said, the facilitator took a very active role, observed closely the progress of the group, reacted on contingencies, and gradually faded and performed transfer of responsibility. So fading became obvious that at the start of each of the three modeling phases, the facilitator briefly deployed the procedural scaffolds and then stepped back again, only pointed at the strategic scaffolds if necessary, and actively faded back and forth in terms of support. Contingency, whenever real contingencies arise, when people didn't know how to proceed, the metacognitive scaffolds were deployed, so people were pointed at what to think about next, to reflect on whether they used the notational concepts right, and whether they were sure, for example, that they already reached a common understanding at different parts of the model. As you could recognize, model representation partially worked well. So we have a structure that basically fundamentally resembled the modeling guidelines. As you can recognize here, we still have this blue-red pattern. The yellow ones are used differently because the yellow ones usually should be anchored on the red cards, but here are anchored communication-centric on the stakeholders on the blue cards. So model representation worked pretty well in terms of transfer of responsibility. The facilitator let people work the way they wanted. Model articulation was clearly observable, so people really were able to contribute to their own view to the common model, and also model alignment was observable. How we actually observed this and how we judged the green, orange, and red ones would go beyond the scope of this paper now. I'm happy to discuss this in the question session if you want to. So what we found out in terms of scaffolding is that scaffolding, as the third case has shown, actually works, but is highly dependent on those deployment of the principle of scaffolding. So simply providing static scaffolds in terms of documents, providing the templates, providing textual guidance or guidelines, principles, enable scaffolding, but is never sufficient. The crucial role is the role of the facilitator and of the peers. So if they actively deploy scaffolds, depending on their perceptions of the actual situation during modeling, scaffolding is pretty can be assumed to work easier than if nobody really intervenes here. And maybe the most important finding is that different kind of scaffolds can be delivered most effectively via different channels. You remember that we had those static scaffolds, the facilitator based scaffold and the peer-based scaffolds, and we could identify that, for example, those strategic scaffolds can rather easily be provided via static scaffolds, whereas procedural scaffolds or metacognitive scaffolds need to be provided by actively by a human actor or by a system that pretends to be a human. So taking this as the central finding, what's the consequence? The consequence is the next iteration of the design framework. As you might have recognized that we only use the framework for analytical purposes right now. This was the first iteration. The next iteration, we want to use it actually for workshop design, for designing appropriate support during modeling workshops. Then we explicitly need to account for channel selection, so provide guidance or provide the possibility to consider channel selection more explicitly than it is the case right now. And what's missing right now, because it's currently ongoing research, is we need to specify instantiation guidelines. So how to actually work with this framework, not in analytical purposes, but for designing purposes. So how to instantiate scaffolding in modeling workshops. Well, that's it. Thank you for your attention. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them right now.